Poker 106, How to Play No Limit Hold'em Postflop. If you haven't watched Poker 104 and 105, please go back and watch those courses. As we said in Poker 105, postflop poker can't be reduced to a simple chart or formula. That said, we can give you a good framework to start from. In addition to the factors mentioned in Poker 105, of vital importance is how the board interacts with your hand, your opponent's range, and your range as perceived by your opponent. No hand, including pocket aces, is strong enough that it can't be outflopped, so don't get married to your hand. Some easy to remember rules. If the board does not contain at least 3 cards of a single suit, a flush is not possible. If the board does not contain 3 cards within 4 ranks of each other, a straight is not possible. For example, on a flop of 7-4 deuce, a straight is not possible because the deuce and the 7 are 5 ranks apart. If the board is not paired, a full house and 4 of a kind are not possible. In Poker 104, we recommended betting with strong made hands. In this course, we can give the following guidelines for hand strength in No Limit Hold'em. Top pair with a strong kicker is usually strong enough to bet the flop. As the hand proceeds, the chances of a player making stronger hands increases, and a single pair, even pocket aces, will often be reduced to a bluff catcher or worse. If a flush or straight is possible, those hands are typically very strong, and lesser hands are medium strength or worse. If the board is paired but no flush or obvious straights are possible, 3 of a kind is a strong hand, 2 pair is medium strength, and 1 pair, the pair on the board, is junk. If there are 4 of a suit on the board, it only takes 1 more card to make a flush. The best 1 or 2 cards make strong hands. The next few make bluff catchers, and the rest are good enough to check down, but probably not good enough to call a bet, despite technically being a flush. If only 1 card is required to make a straight, it's very important which card that is. For example, on a King, Queen, Jack 10 board, it's highly likely that someone has an ace, and you probably can't call a bet with a 9 for a King high straight. But on a 4 tray deuce ace board, ace king is still a strong hand in many situations. Please note that these are very general guidelines for a beginner. The betting action in particular greatly influences what is considered strong or weak. Bluffing. In Poker 104, we said you can use any of the betting options with draws, and you should bluff junk on the river. This is true, and in No Limit Hold'em, you should bluff quite frequently. Factors that favor bluffing. Your hand has low showdown value. When your range seems to connect to the board much better than your opponent's. You have shown strength so far this hand. When the board changes in an obvious way, such as a flush or straight completing, or a low card on the board pairing. When your opponent's last action was to check, especially if they don't understand the concept of checking medium strength hands. You have blockers to a strong hand, a concept which we will not cover in this course. Before the river, it's best to bluff with hands that have a chance to improve, aka draws. 3 factors that almost prohibit bluffing. 1. Your opponent is a calling station who rarely bets but loves to call. 2. You played your hand like a draw, maybe because it was a draw, and the obvious draw is missed. 3. You have an image, whether earned or unearned, as a bluff-happy player. If any of these 3 circumstances apply, wait for them to change to resume your bluffing ways. Contrary to popular opinion, it's best to semi-bluff early in the hand, rather than waiting to miss everything and then bluff because you have no other choice. Position. Position is very important in No Limit Hold'em and underrated by beginners. The player or players first to act are said to be out of position. The player last to act is said to be in position. Being in position is very helpful as your opponent must act first every street. If you are out of position, lean towards raising or folding on the flop and turn, rather than calling and having to act first again. Always check to the preflop raiser on the flop if you are out of position. To bet into the preflop raiser is called a donk bet. For a brief explanation why, Ask yourself, what would you do if you flopped a very strong hand like top set? If the answer is check raise, of course, then by donk betting, you are declaring that you don't have a very strong hand. You will also usually check the turn and river if the aggressor from the previous street has position. The main exception to this rule is when the texture of the board changes in a significant way, like a flush draw being completed or a small card on the board pairing. In Poker 104, we explained equity and pot odds and briefly mentioned implied odds and effective odds. Let's go a bit deeper. In fixed limit and no limit hold'em, we often talk about the rule of 4 and 2, which is a two-step process to determine your chance to win the hand or your equity. Step 1. Estimate your number of outs. That's how many cards will give you the best hand. Step 2. Multiply that number by 4% if on the flop, or 2% if on the turn. The resulting number is your approximate chance to win the hand. Effective odds. This is a term rarely used in no limit because if you have to call more than one bet, your effective odds are almost always terrible. The important thing to know about effective odds is to use the rule of 2 when on the flop, and significant betting might occur on the turn. The rule of 4 is very useful in no limit hold'em, but only when you or your opponent will be all in on the flop. Implied odds are crucial when considering draws and even made hands. For example, there is 100 in the pot on the turn, and you and your opponent have deep stacks. Your opponent bets half pot, and you have a draw with a 1 in 5 chance of winning, as is fairly common with a straight or flush draw. Your pot odds are 3 to 1, or 25%, and your odds of hitting your draw are 4 to 1, or 20%. Without implied odds, you cannot even call this smallish bet with this strong draw. However, if you hit and you can expect to get called half the time if you make a pot size bet, the math changes dramatically. Now, if you miss, you have still lost the 50 you called on the turn. But if you hit, you win not only the 100 in the pot, the 50 turn bet, but also another 200 50% of the time. Your pot odd plus implied odds are 50 to 250, or 17% contributed to the pot. Implied odds are so important that we often talk about reverse implied odds. For example, you'll often need to fold middling pairs out of position on the flop, even if they are likely to be the best hand right now. This is because you'll be at a disadvantage by the river when the bets are much bigger. You could also think about this problem in terms of effective odds. If you only have to call a pot-sized bet on the flop, you are getting 2 to 1 pot odds. However, if you have to call pot-sized bets on the flop, turn, and river, your effective pot odds are a mere 14 to 13. Bet sizing. In Poker 104, we gave an excellent framework for combining the 3 betting actions with 4 hand categories, but we didn't say anything about bet sizing. Being able to choose your bet size adds a ton of complexity and is what makes no limit hold'em the Cadillac of poker. When you bet, you will usually want to bet somewhere between half of the pot to equal to the size of the pot. Try to pick a size that you could effectively use in your current situation, whether you are value betting or bluffing. Don't give away the strength of your hand. If you are raising, you must imagine the call going into the pot first, then raise 50% to 100% of that new pot. For example, if there is 100 in the pot and your opponent bets 50, think of the pot being 200. Therefore, your raise should be 100 to 200 in addition to the 50 you have to call. It is very common for new players to raise too small when they raise. The reason for this sizing recommendation is to give your opponent tough choices between raising, calling, and folding. In tournaments, near the bubble or on the final table, remaining stacks are of vital importance and must be considered before you bet. Calling. We haven't said much about calling, and that's because most new players tend to call much too frequently. Make sure to leave enough medium-strength hands in your checking range so you can't get bluffed every time you check. For example, on an ace-10 deuce board, checking with ace-jack is very reasonable with the plan to call at least one bet. Just because you called a bet on the flop with a medium-strength hand doesn't mean you need to call all the way to the river. You need to balance calling and folding on every street that your opponent bets. Keep in mind how you have represented your hand. If your betting actions have been weak, you may have induced a bluff. But if you've bet strongly and now your opponent plays back at you, think about the hand from your opponent's point of view for a moment before calling. Tells. While tells are one of the most cinematic elements of poker, they are much less important than strategy. That said, live tells are important and are very satisfying when you pick up on one and act on it. We'll give you one classic adage. If your opponent acts strong, he's probably weak. And if your opponent acts weak, he's probably strong. This is because your opponent's willingness to try and act, or Hollywood, probably much stronger than your ability to soul read him. Conclusion. We've given you an excellent framework of how to approach post-flop no-limit hold'em, and we've even given you some secrets that many casual players don't know. However, we've only scratched the surface of this very rich game. If you'd like to hear more, please let us know. Thanks for listening, and as always, please gamble responsibly.